So hello everyone and welcome to this Queers in the Library panel. I'm really excited to be here with some fantastic speakers, fellow librarians, activists, creatives, and we're here to talk about the potential of libraries as spaces for generating and nurturing queer communities, as well as the limits of certain institutional forms of librarianship. So I'll start with some introductions. My name's Alice Corbble and I'll be chairing this panel. I'm currently working in University of Sussex Library. I live in Brighton and I'm working from home, as most people are. So my home seems to be the library these days, both my personal one and my work one. I've worked in libraries for around 10 years, and that started with a training program in radical librarianship at the Feminist Library in London, which really opened up my eyes into what a library can be and the politics of libraries and the politics of gender and sexuality and how they interact with libraries and how we can discover ourselves in libraries. And so that set me off on a path to pursuing what libraries can be in communities. And I've worked in public libraries and academic libraries, and I've researched them. I did a Sociology PhD looking at the cultural politics of libraries in a time of crisis, which particularly looked at austerity over the last 10 years. So yeah, I'm passionate about libraries. I'm curious about them, and I think they're a great way of bringing people together, especially queer communities. So I'm going to start with introducing each of our speakers, beginning with Saradha Soobrayen. Like to start off, Saradha?
Yes, hello everyone. Hello to my fellow panel members. I would describe myself as a creative activist. I'm working with poetry, visual arts and live arts, and I have worked in libraries, both public libraries and specialist libraries. The last library I was working at was the National Poetry Library, which currently is not open to public, but it's still operating on a it's almost like it's the computer boot phase of when the library shuts down. It's temporarily out of sync with the public, but I'm very interested in the ways that we can access libraries and also inclusion and who's excluded from libraries. I was also a member of a panel that presented at the National Poetry Library around teaching. And I was also a poetry editor for a queer literary journal called Chroma, which was digitised for copies of that are available online via the National Poetry Library magazine's site. It's a really great opportunity to really discuss key issues that reflect where we're at today and also where we're thinking about libraries in the future.
Thank you, Saradha. Looking forward to hearing more about those pieces of work you've been involved in. And so Melissa, would you like to go next?
Yeah, my name's Melissa Steiner. I'm currently working in an academic library, Birkbeck, which is part of the University of London. And my specific role is to support disabled students with using the library. Previously, when I was living in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is where I'm from, I was working in a public youth library, and I co-ran an autonomous feminist queer space called Cherry Bomb, which included a library. Since I've been in London, I've been involved in quite a few DIY queer type activities, often with Colette, who's one of the panelists today, actually. I first met Colette when we decided to try and categorise their zines at the 56A zine library, which is in Elephant and Castle. Yeah, and I guess my specific interest at the moment, I did my library science MSc a few years ago, is in the kind of ethics around ownership of collections, particularly with regards to POC communities and queer communities, and also around access to those collections and just to information generally, because I really think that libraries need to think about how they support and are implicated in things around, disability rights activism, anti-racism and workers' rights, particularly in the pandemic, though it's obviously quite difficult at the moment. But I just think libraries need to be, that needs to be part of our kind of core work, I guess.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Melissa. So much to talk about together there. I'm going to move on now to Colette Townend.
Hi, so yes, my name's Colette. I work in Lambeth Libraries now. I've worked there since 2013. Yeah, I met Melissa like, I guess, 10, 12 years ago when she moved here, and the way that she talked about working in libraries, like, maybe you want to work in a library. So that's sort of how I started. And yes, when I first worked in libraries, it was just after the last recession, and so library jobs were really few and far between. And I worked across a number of councils. I worked in Croydon, Enfield, and Merton before settling back at Lambeth. And Lambeth's got a amazing queer and Black history in terms of library services. We've always had like a really large Black History Month, and the last few years, especially with the big LGBT month programs, Pride programs as well. So it feels like half the year we're doing LGBT festivals. And yeah, and also the last year I just completed, also qualified doing a master's at University. And as part of my research there, I was really interested in, I guess, working with older colleagues who had gone through Section 28 and seen the beginning of Black History Month, and a lot of that coming from radical municipal politics in the 1980s, and sort of how those actually were, interestingly, the result of the same lot of work within local government. And so I spoke to a lot of, did a lot of research with like librarians of that generation around that period.
Excellent, thank you, Colette. Lots of synergies with the other speakers to talk about there. So Leila, Kassir, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hello, my name's Leila. I'm currently a librarian, an academic librarian at the University of London in the Senate House Library. And I've worked for about 20 years now in libraries, mainly academic libraries, but I see my relationship with libraries going back to my childhood, where I was very fortunate. I'm relatively old compared to other people on this panel, I think, and I look back to my childhood with a really well-funded public library service, and I did a lot of my learning, my own personal learning, through the public library systems. So they've always meant a great deal to me. But I've ended up working in academic libraries, which have different tensions within them with regards access and exclusion, I would say, but also a lot of potential too. I also have a lot of experience within grassroots radical libraries as well, and I was a volunteer for a while at the same library that Colette and Melissa have done work on, as 56A Info Shop, which is an anarchist collective within South London. I didn't work on the zine collection there, but I helped archive the massive and ever-growing paper archive there, with the very rich holdings of queer pamphlets, booklets, magazines going back many decades, and from quite a wide range of countries as well. I also have a long-term involvement with small press and DIY presses going back decades as well. And on the back of that, I founded a really large zine collection at one of my last jobs. And I suppose I'm quite interested in the tensions between how you can, if you can, incorporate radical politics and ideas within institutional settings, whether that is even possible, and whether or not things like that tend to get co-opted and used for other ends, which maybe isn't the right original intention of those, even if there's a lot of good meaning behind it. It's a long time ago since I did my dissertation on libraries, and I did it on working class libraries and the history of those. And I think class is another aspect which I think is one of the things I'm most interested in, alongside sort of as a sort of an intersectional aspect, which is often overlooked, but one I think also needs to feed into any discussion of queer community access as well.
Brilliant, thank you, Leila. I love that question you just posed about the potential for radical politics within institutional spaces. We'll be coming back to that. And then finally, let's introduce Kiron Clark.
Hi, I'm Ciaran. So I also work at the University of Sussex Library. So my role there is library administration, but also communications. So I deal with the digital side of things, social media, marketing, that kind of thing for the library. But my story with libraries, I think, similarly to what Leila said, goes back to childhood. I'm sort of a legacy library professional. My stepmother was a library assistant, and my introduction to libraries came from there. then later, when I was an adult, I was instrumental in relaunching Outhouse Library, which is a queer library in Dublin. So when I came to that library, it was an underused space. They weren't really, and I should say a bit about Outhouse. Outhouse is a queer community centre in Dublin, and they had a collection of books, queer books that had been donated by the community. So coming into that space, I relaunched it, and it's now currently still operating. And yeah, I suppose my interest in libraries is a bit varied. I think I pivoted into libraries during a period of like my personal struggle, and was seeking out queer communities and discovered this library, and was able to sort of form this queer community through this library. And that's kind of informed my work in libraries ever since, the double strands of mental health advocacy and queer advocacy within library spaces. So I've also worked in public libraries and now in academic libraries, so seen a few different settings for libraries. And that kind of thread of working towards advocating for mental health and advocating for queerness in library spaces has kind of followed me.
Really good to hear everyone's introductions, and I think they've already set some really interesting threads for the discussion to follow. But I thought I'll start, first of all, as we've thought about libraries together and we've all worked in them in different ways. I think it's helpful to separate out the ways in which libraries function and operate through, first of all, their spaces, their places people can go and be and spend time in, whether that's physical or virtual, more likely these days. And then there's the people behind the libraries who facilitate them. So there's the work of the library. And then finally, there's the things that the libraries circulate and organize, the books, the collections, the literature. So we're going to structure our conversation according to those three themes, and we're going to start with space. So I'd like to hear from you how the physical or virtual spaces of the libraries you've been involved in or experienced, how they can help shape queer communities, and how this can work both within or against the institutions of which they're a part. Now, picking up where Ciaran just left off, I think they're often a safe space for people. So I don't know if that's a topic anyone wants to start with. Oh, and I should add that we're talking about queerness here, not simply as a sort of umbrella term for LGBT identity, as it can often be co-opted as in sort of neoliberal senses. We're more interested in queerness as a disruption of and troubling of heteronormativity.
I'd like to start thinking from a different angle in terms of how for the National Poetry Library members and people who were unable to access the library, suddenly the change.org petition became a space, and in a sense in terms of queerness, in terms of suddenly voices that were not necessarily heard, it was suddenly afforded a public arena, a collaborative space where people could sign a petition, but also talk about what the library meant, and also comment on the kinds of interactions they had within the library. And these could be people that had access to the library on a frequent basis or on a kind of haphazard basis. So it was very interesting to kind of feel, actually, as a library assistant, where did the belonging start and end, and just listening to the panel biographies and how it hadn't really struck me how each change or collection that has been brought into the public, thinking about the zines or thinking about projects that people individually worked on, we don't ever get to hear or see those invisible hands. And so there's something around invisibility and queerness that I'm kind of very aware of at the moment.
That's a really interesting way to start. Does anyone want to follow on from that?
I was just thinking that's a really good point, Saradha. in that this invisible hand of people, that libraries are something that Alice mentioned before this panel started, was that basically libraries are the people that are involved in making these spaces and developing these spaces, and they all have their own relationships to libraries and their own connections to libraries, and that informs the space. It informs the politics of the space and what the philosophy of that space then becomes. I know certainly in Outhouse, so I think two things to pick up on there is that, so with Outhouse, it was situated within a community centre. So the large focus of that community centre was outreach for the LGBT community. And as so they had counselling, they had outreach into the community, they had a testing site there as well for HIV. And then they also had this library. And I think part of what was successful about it was twofold. So I think it was about having an identity for people coming into that space and finding identity and finding this space of books and space of literature so that they could form identity. And that was them forming queerness, but it was also about just existing and representing, having a queer library in Dublin that is the only one in Dublin was also a challenge to the heteronormativity of library institutions in Dublin. Just by its very existence, that was challenging and troubling, that sort of status quo of only having straight libraries with one shelf of LGBTQ, material. Or what happened when I was in public libraries was a move to integrate those shelves in a sort of post-queer way, integrate them into the rest of the collection because we no longer need them.
In terms of the kind of idea around visibility and invisibility, I guess I can't not think about, I'm going to probably keep coming back to the pandemic, because obviously that's at the forefront of all of our minds, and maybe Colette, you could speak to this more working in public libraries, but at the moment, it's there's this whole discourse around how essential libraries are and the fact that loads of people don't have the internet or don't have access to equipment, which is important in universities as well. But perhaps what isn't being talked about so much is the fact that people actually have to go to open up a library and therefore are putting themselves at risk. And I think it's really difficult for librarians who, I think most people really are concerned about that, people getting access to this information, but at what cost? And I think that kind of has been a bit invisibilised at the moment in this kind of general discussion.
Yeah, I'd like to support that. Actually, Melissa, that's a really important point, that there is, even within library staff, that not all, where I work, not all staff, I'm one of the privileged ones I'm sitting in my kitchen talking to you at the moment. But other people are there for click and collect, for monitoring study spaces and other reading rooms. And it's through their work that the library is, managing to stay open and allowing that, because there is that discrepancy in society whereby some people do not have safe spaces at home, they do not have the internet at home, they do not have a table at home, and libraries are also all those very physical things as well. And I think that goes back to what you were saying about spaces, Alice, as well, and it links into what Melissa's just said about the spaces, at once a theoretical space, and there's also a physical space, and they sometimes work against each other. I think that a lot of us might say there is a hope within libraries, and there is something we are all aiming for, which in its most wonderful way can manifest in what Ciaran was saying in the outside library, which it can become this wonderful meeting point. But there are also times when it can also be a resistance to that. And if I'm thinking very literally about buildings, I work in a really stunning building. It's 19-storey tower in the centre of London, which is an Art Deco building. It's beautiful, but the library begins on the 4th floor, and to get into that building you have to feel confident enough to enter it. And we all, the idea of having libraries built as towers is one, I think, that symbolises the idea of learning, which is this building going up into the sky, into the ether. And that is quite awe-inspiring in all what that means. It's fear and wonder. and there's fear involved in that. And I think as well, those things can also be things we need to overcome. I think once you get in there, there's all these wonderful staff who are also putting themselves out there to keep the building going in these really awful times. And in more normal times, there's lots more staff in there. And once you get to us, I think people would find it a different experience than maybe standing outside it. And I've, in my time working in libraries, I've had to actually meet students outside in the street to help them come in. Not necessarily at Senate House Library, but other libraries as well, with less forbidding outsides. And just the thought of libraries isn't in itself always engaging to people. And I think that is something we need to acknowledge as library workers, that it's our natural daily environment, and in a way we can become unseeing to what those anxieties are. And I think it does link even more now, as you're saying, Melissa, and I'm rambling now, I think, but it links more to the ideas that it's not always accessible to people, and how do we make it become more like Ciaran's example? How can we bring those feelings into more institutional settings, I think.
Mm-hmm. I work in a public library, and over the last year, due to being in different tiers, we've been opening up and closing. We're only closed now because the second wave has been so terrible and rates in our area are so high. And I think one thing that I was thinking about earlier when we were talking about this discussion about spaces, in our spaces, we have a duty as representing our communities to cater to our community, and a proportion of that community are LGBT. So you think a portion of your collections, your spaces, your event should be. There's also, I think, in some spaces, queer interventions that you can make by having a drag queen story time or an author event in the evening, where people have come in from the cold into a warm building that's still open at 8 p.m. and they come across an author event and they sit down and they listen, and they may be someone that's not come across a queer author ever before in their life. They could then borrow that book and go on a reading journey and everything that comes with that. And I really miss that as not having that in the last year. And we've been doing a huge program of online events. So we've been doing reading groups. We're now doing a reading group program where we're going to have weekly LGBT read together sessions. And I did a queer story time. We've been doing that. But I think that's something that we've really missed this year, that I think we need to recognise that public libraries, that I have to say a lot more than academic libraries, can have that space that people can just walk into. And I think it's really brilliant that academic libraries, I know, Melissa, you've done LGBT events that have been free for people to enter. I know Senate House Library have done free exhibitions on queer subjects. And those are really great things that we do within our spaces as well.
Yeah, I think definitely there's that, in my own experience, there's definitely two very different framings with academic and public libraries, as you say, Colette. I mean, our library, Sussex Library, the architecture is brutalist and it's up on a hill. So that idea of it being this gatekeeping, ivory tower, intimidating, is literally built into the architecture of the building for us. And that's something that queerness can challenge, I think. And as queer people, we can challenge that and challenge hierarchies and try to create spaces that are more hybrid and more horizontal within our own work practices, so that, and that's about accessibility and representation and about inviting people through the doors. It's something that public libraries do really well, I think. And, special libraries, the Queer Library in Dublin, I try to do really well, is make sure that it is accessible in terms of just the philosophy of the place, and in terms of the actual events that are going on. You're getting people through the door because you're trying to build a community within that space, and a queer community within that space. I think maybe this is something to bring up, and I'm interested to hear the other panelists' thoughts on how academic libraries are able to do that, or if they're able to do that.
I think one of the things that they can do, because academic library membership is different, obviously, than public library membership. So where I work, obviously, you automatically can become a member if you're a University of London student. But one thing that does rupture that are the exhibitions, which are free and always are free to everybody, anybody. And I think that's why, I mean, Richard Espley was going to join us today, was unable to in the end, but he initiated the Queer Between the Covers exhibition, which happened a couple of years ago at Senate House Library. And I know he really fought for that, and he really wanted to get that in place because, and I think once it did introduce the library to people who were not students, which was great. And, you know, people are welcome back afterwards, but maybe don't feel they can come. You know, but once you come to a free exhibition and you can come as many times as you like, it starts to become a less forbidding space, and you start to think, okay, I've walked in here, I've got this far, I've got into this area, maybe I could go into that area, you know. And I think that way as well, and also to see those books represented. And I think it links to what you said as well, Ciaran, about you interfiled. I really found that very interesting that you went and interfiled the books from what was previously an LGBT section. You merge those books within the wider library. And I think that's hopefully something we'll all discuss as well, about how those decisions are made. Because I think one thing the Queer Between the Covers exhibition showed, we did a little project at the side of that where we asked visitors to the exhibition to choose their favourite queer book, or the book that maybe spoke most to them and their queer identity. And we've got a little online library, which is you can still add to if you want. But what was really interesting, a lot of those books were not what we might say were queer books. They were not necessarily written by a queer author or with queer themes. For instance, someone chose Bleak House by Charles Dickens. Someone chose Frankenstein and a very particular edition of it, an abridged schools edition, you know. And it's these kind of books that's where I recognise myself. And I think that, you know, by you know, it's a serendipitous acknowledgement of your own identity sometimes, which is, you can find that queer identity in lots of places. And I think that that's something as well that libraries are very good at doing when they disperse their collections, but it's getting people to them, isn't it, I guess?
Yeah, on that point then, I think, yeah, there's loads to pick up on there. And I think we'll try and weave those thoughts back in when we talk about collections and literature a bit more. But just picking up on, like, trying to draw together some of the points on space, and also how academic libraries work differently to public libraries. I was thinking a bit about your concepts of the outhouse library, Kiron, and the very name outhouse, I think, is obviously a great name for a queer library. I'm thinking in terms of how we reach people and how we increase visibility and enable people to be seen and heard in libraries, or even to find them. So I think we need to think about taking the library out of the library and putting it somewhere else as well. So perhaps that's one way in which academic libraries, which are not so accessible because they're in a tower, or at Sussex, you know, we're on a campus on the rural edges of Bryan and Falmer that you have to take a bus or a train to. So not only is it for students, you know, the public can use that university library, it is open to the public as well. But who's going to go there, and how are they going to just come across it? So are there ways in which more rarefied or academic libraries can take themselves out of the library and go into communities? And I'm thinking also of some of your work there, Colette, on your research that you did for your dissertation around the community librarianship movement of the sort of 70s and 80s, where a lot of that happened, where you know, outreach was a really well invested in process of library work. So I'm wondering if we can use that as a transition to think more about the work of libraries, and how library workers, whether they're, you know, professional librarians or volunteers or activists or community outreach folk, what is it there that can enable queerness? What kind of labour is involved? And what's at stake there with the kind of work element of how libraries can queer or enable queerness?
I think one of the, I think it was Kiron, you said something about queerness challenging hierarchies. And I think one of the ways that academic libraries can really do that, and Birkbeck is doing that, is to have more student interaction and give more ownership to students. So the last couple of years, when we have done events for LGBT History Month, the student union's been quite heavily involved. But I think in academic libraries, we tend to sway towards the, what do our NSS scores look like? And it, you know, becomes this kind of neoliberal, like fulfilling the consumer's needs or whatever. And I don't think that's what libraries should be doing. And I think our interactions with students have had really positive results. So, for example, Birkbeck we created a new collection called Reading for Pleasure, and we basically got students to recommend books for this whole new collection, and they could pick any books they liked, but they had to be from local bookstores in the Bloomsbury area, which included shops like Gaze the Word. So we ended up with a really interesting collection of books, some of which came from quite small press and weren't necessarily related to like reading lists that the students were working from. And yeah, I found that quite rewarding. And I think the interaction between the librarians and the students was really rewarding as well. Like it was kind of a mutual discussion rather than us telling them or us being driven by the NSS scores, things like that.
I'm quite interested in how academic research or community research can also allow library workers in both public and academic libraries really understand their core constituents in terms of, for example, Lambeth. I know for a fact that it has the highest rates of HIV in the country, and so and also in terms of Black communities, Asian communities, the health inequalities, and whether library workers have access to health index for their particular boroughs or the particular areas that they're working in. I think it's a really important movement at the moment where the creative arts and health and science and medical establishments are like GP surgeries are really, we've gone beyond the books on prescription into a kind of realm now of really trying to understand what are the issues that are affecting people and it's where people go to find a diagnosis or to kind of get more information around long-term conditions that they may be facing. And I'm just wondering whose responsibility is it in terms of the work and the distribution of the work?
That's very interesting that you bring that up, Saradha, because it makes me think as well of the underground work that libraries do. And specifically I'm thinking about in Ireland in the 80s, librarians being sites where women could get education about abortion when it was illegal. And that being one of the, what role do library professionals have in health, providing information around healthcare, providing information around queerness, providing information around race and race equity struggles, when the culture, there's no other place for them to get that information. And what role do librarians then have? They are informational professionals, but they're also providing pastoral care to the community in providing this information. And sort of that happens under the radar still quite a lot, I'm sure. But certainly in the 80s and 90s was happening under the radar in Ireland.
I think also there needs to be training and education for librarians and library workers. Maybe people who have qualified recently may have done, someone who's heterosexual looking at forming an LGBT collection. How do they engage with that? Do they have knowledge themselves, or like Melissa said, do they work with the community to decide what that collection is that does represent them? I think also training around LGBTQ issues that are relevant and helpful, how to help people, in terms of queer housing and health. I think quite interesting this week, the statement from the Feminist Library that came out is really interesting, that talked about the volunteer and worker accountability at the Feminist Library, because there's been a lot of concern within feminist and queer communities for a while around whether that's a safe space for trans people. So, and I think the work behind that is absolutely excellent. The way that they talked about accountability going forward with that, I think hopefully will be really welcome to trans people and the wider community going forward, accessing that space. And that's very much to do with the responsibility that the workers there will take on.
I'm really glad you brought that up, Colette. Because obviously we need to make sure we all think about the T in LGBT in our work as much as possible, and also the question of accountability in librarianship is absolutely key to this discussion, I think, and disrupting the myth of neutrality in librarianship is extremely important. So where some librarians may do some under the radar or underground work, as you've said over history, Ciaran, there will be others who will have tried to sanction things like that and say it's not the role of a library to do that because librarians have the holy grail of neutrality. And but what sets that neutrality? what institutional and cultural norms are assumed to be neutral? So I wonder if that's something anyone could speak to in terms of the work of libraries.
I think Section 28 definitely gave permission for that long period, 1988 to 2003, for librarians who were homophobic to chuck books out, to not offer those services to members of the public. And I think part of my research showed, and a lot of researchers showed, that's meant that academic libraries have done a lot better because they weren't under the Local Government Act, but in a way, public libraries are really behind on that and just still catching up in terms of cultural representation.
Colette, do you want to just quickly put a little definition around that for those who may not know? Perhaps some of our younger audience might need a bit of history there.
Like, I mean, I grew up in the 90s and didn't read a single queer book in a library in school or, in a public library. And that was because in the 80s, because of supposed children's LGBT books being available in libraries, the Thatcher government brought in a law that would sanction the promotion of homosexuality in any services that local government gave. So delivered to that would be like book collections, events, things they funded like theatre events and health, etc. So that affected an entire generation, and lots of old library workers. So John Vincent, there's some research over the last 10 years that have found that many library workers think that's still in place and have not done enough to create collections that represent people.
Wow.
Because I think that's also the huge amount of, therefore, I don't know, Colette, about the retrospective work that needs to be done to reclaim that period, which is decades. Because I was actually 16 when the Section 28 was enacted. And so I grew up in a slightly different, I saw that change. I went through the school library system where, I remember I was really lucky that we had a school library, and the school librarian said to me, I think you might like to read this person called Stevie Smith, was handing me these books. And I know that wouldn't have been certain people's experiences after that point, and how does that happen? I mean, this is a genuine question about how does that work now happen to reclaim those decades of absolute erasure, and that is something. And I think, although, as you're very right, Colette, that academic libraries were less affected because they do not come under the Local Authority Act, it doesn't mean to say that they correspondingly went out of their way to promote either. And I think that there was still a lot of hidden work going on there as well. Things were not being made explicit even within those realms, even though the books might have been there.
Well, I suppose it's as well, and I'm thinking particularly about communications as well in libraries, is, what are you allowed to communicate through your communications channels? What are you allowed to put what exhibitions are you allowed to put on? How much time and space do we put towards those collections? Is it just once a year during LGBT History Month, or do we allow space throughout the year? And I think there's still legacies of that definitely going on in academic, public, and in academic and public libraries. And a lot of the work is reparative. A lot of the work of queer librarians is reparative. It's, having a vision of what libraries are and the radical role that libraries can play and librarians can play, and in each piece of work, making it as queer as possible.
I was just going to say, it just makes me think about the word intersectionality, and this idea of the Walt Whitman quote about I contain multitudes of selves, and this idea that within the library structure, heterosexuality is presumed, and it was only after kind of finding these other voices and these other choices and options to around language, then can one really access identities and inhabit and a space that is welcoming. I think there's something around welcome that really ties in with the refugee and asylum seekers movement in terms of how do we create welcome.
And maybe this point comes up more under the kind of collections banner, but it makes me think about a collection I did a bit of research into, which is the Ruckus Archive, which was owned by Ajamu. I don't know if you've heard about it, but it's basically, it's his personal collection of like Black gay life in the 1980s, you know, like club flyers and, you know, just things that were going on. And he deposited it in the London Metropolitan Archives. And then he got members of that community to come and like do descriptors of the different kind of pieces of the archive and go through it. And I just think that must have been such an amazing experience for people to have, like, to be in kind of an archive like London Metropolitan Archives, but to have the control over describing their basically stuff that comes from their own community and their own past. But I think that kind of experience is all too rare, but was such a good way of kind of bringing things together.
Yeah, definitely. I wonder if we could use that point now we've sort of come onto archive, and also notion of intersectionality and multiple selves, multiple identities. If we could kind of segue between the work of librarianship and the collections themselves through the notions of how they're organised. So, sorry, it's a big question, but Saradha, I saw you put in the chat, I think a point someone made earlier made you think of the problematic nature of the Dewey system, which most public libraries use, some academic libraries use Dewey. And then you've got like Library of Congress, which many academic libraries use. And then if we're talking about archives, that's a whole other ballgame, of course, of how you arrange and describe them and how they are accessed. So would anyone like to come in on that and talk about sort of how we might be able to queer how we organise library or archival collections, or alternatively, how they are really not queer and what the problems are with that?
I think one of the big problems with any library description is in the phrase itself. We use that, well, the official library term is controlled vocabulary. And I think that very nature, that's it, is controlled vocabulary, but who's controlled that? And you've mentioned few systems, all of which were generated in the 19th century by white men, white North American men as well. And we are working usually within one of those systems. At Senate House Library, we work within those Dewey, Library of Congress and Bliss, which is our main one. So we've got three systems all created by very similar people, in a sense, with similar identities perhaps, and similar worldviews. And I find, obviously, we can't create, with a library the size of Senate House Library, 2 million books, a system that's going to be different, but there is a way to critique it, I think. And there is a way to constantly raise that as something we as library workers recognise as problematic. And when we have library members who say, well, why is this doing here? Why is that separated from that, when that's intimately connected or something? I think we acknowledge that and we say, yeah, this is where you are not in the wrong. If you're not finding yourself on the shelf, it's not because of you. It's like, it is the system around it. This is how we can critique it. And I definitely think we all need to, at very least, be starting to, and I know a lot of everyone in this room is, and loads of library workers are doing that, just acknowledging that these are worldviews that we're working within.
Yeah, I think we need to sort of also remember here that these are discussions that not enough librarians are having. Luckily, they're starting to have them a bit more, but they're also things that, understandably, a library user is not likely to think about, because you go into a library you either know what you want or you're browsing, and there are lots of different ways of discovering things. You don't necessarily think about how they're organised unless you're following signs or you're looking in a catalogue. You're not necessarily connecting the system of what put them there. Mm-hmm. And also the system of selection that chose the items in the stock that are in there. So how can we have that conversation more publicly so that people can understand the ideology of these systems and the fact that they are fundamentally, usually, completely hierarchical systems, and for good functional reasons often, but the thoughts that go into that hierarchy. So why did Dewey think, or why did the main, I've forgotten their names, the Library of Congress dudes, but why did they think that certain things were at the top of a certain field or category of knowledge, whereas women or Black people or sexual deviants, as they were probably called then, were relegated to a sub-decimal point and subcategory. Yeah, so I think that was something that really blew my mind when I first learned about library classification from quite a basic level at the Feminist Library. And I learned that the woman who'd organized that collection in the beginning was, which was a collection of resources and literature written by and for women in the second wave feminist movement at that point in time, had decided to create a non-hierarchical system of organization and discovery. And I was like, wow, what does that mean? What does that mean about how I find things and who these identities are in a space?
But it's interesting what you mentioned about this hierarchy and this decision-making process, and the word intimacy has come up in terms of how things are placed and in terms of collections, and it's making me remember this a panel event that was held at the National Poetry Library to promote its teaching section, and it was a queer event, and with the writer Betsy Warland, and the title was Queer Poet Teachers on Visibility and Intimacy with the Page. And so I'm thinking around how library users, library borrowers could be invited to talk about what collections, what items they feel a kind of intimacy with. If we look at the word intimacy or into me see, one of the wonderful things that used to happen on a regular basis in a public library was books used to speak to me. A title would catch my eye. I thought, oh right, I'm supposed to be reading that now. And it can work in the reverse way for poets and would-be writers. They're writing the books they want to read. And so there's something around when I think about these figureheads, that the proximity of queerness or Black lives was so far away from their actual experience. How do we bring the experience of the so-called hidden minorities, and I think today we have to talk about trans issues. We have to talk about transphobia as being the kind of really hot potato, the elephant in the room kind of thing. How do we bring a closer inspection or for everyone to be able to engage?
Mm-hmm. Brilliant question. Thank you, Saradha.
I think also there's a bit of a tension between the visibility of LGBT collections and maybe the hiddenness of where people feel safe and whether the section's there and whether someone's approaching an LGBT collection. I've certainly heard of at prison libraries people wanting LGBT books but not wanting, a spine label saying they're LGBT because they're incredibly macho environments. People's fear of their safety. Also, I can't count the amount of times that I've found my LGBT signs in the bin. Like people don't like that they can see it and they'll go and destroy that. I know other people like heard lots of things about people's displays being wrecked. I think also the idea of pulling the collection out and putting it in the mainstream. I looked at that a bit of my dissertation, like the idea of Nadine Doherty talking about Black History Month talked about in education it being annexed, where like all of that is put into 1 month and not mainstream throughout the rest of the thing. I guess I tend to put them in both. Like I tend to find like if I've got like in the public library, you get a hardback come out first and then like a paperback. And instead of chucking the hardback away, that's like a really good opportunity to like have the book in both places for people to find.
I think that's a really good point and something that like definitely in the queer library and then moving to public libraries. So I had this queer library that was all queer books. So people knew what it was, they were coming, they had a very specific thing in mind. But then my own experience as a young person, I wanted to go into a library, find a book and not necessarily have to deal with somebody because I was at that stage. So that's something that I think you're right to say there's a real tension there. And I think the only approach really is, first of all, we need librarians who are sensitive and trained and can pick up on coded language and can pick up on users' needs and the different sort of stages that somebody is at when they're requesting materials. And also, when we're thinking about organizing libraries, having more than one approach. So having a section for queer books and then also interfiling them within the main body. so that it's accessible to accessible to people, no matter what stage they are and what their journey is and what their story is.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. I think that's the right approach too, to have those, you can have a specific place, but then to interfile and also it means therefore that someone who might not think that they want to read a queer book will stumble across a queer book, just serendipitously. But I was also thinking about that thing you said, Ciaran, about having to go into a library and ask for something, and at what stage you yourself, the reader, might be at wanting to say, in a way, you're revealing something about yourself at that point that you may or may not be ready to reveal. And that's something I think about. I don't know how much it happens in public libraries, but in academic libraries, there's this sense of having reserve stock, or you have the open access stock, which is browsable. You can just go and read and you don't even have to borrow it if you don't want. But then there's stuff that is hidden up in the tower or hidden off site that you then have to fill out a form, request it. And some of the reasons behind that, there are quite a lot of contradictory reasons. Some of those are because people think no one's going to read that, and that is a prejudicial, potentially, attitude. But equally, sometimes it is based on the fact that the book is very rare, and a lot of queer literature has never been reprinted, especially earlier queer literature. Might have come out once even in the 60s, be very hard to replace and very expensive to replace. And with library budgets declining, it's not as if a book that cost £300, if it went missing, could be replaced. And I know that the collections I manage, which are literature collections, certain authors get stolen more than others. And people have reasons for stealing, which we're not going to go into. But, certain books get stolen. And those books, John Veners, a gay poet, whose books are very rare. Juna Barnes is another writer whose works always are getting stolen. So it makes a decision. If you can't get cheap replaceable editions, what do you do with that book to safeguard it for the community and for everybody? I tend to make it reference only, or I tend to say it has to be requested. And I realise that's putting up another barrier, particularly when it is a queer work. But then if you leave it out on the shelf, it's gone and then no one's got it. So it's those weird tensions as well, not wanting to make that harder for people to access things that have actually, because of the nature of the work, no one's reprinted them. There is a dearth of reprints, a dearth of accessible editions sometimes for works people might want to read.
And I think in terms of invisibilised collections, specifically for academic libraries, we need to really be thinking about open access for digital items. There's such a wealth of material out there, queer material, trans material, black material in databases that people can't access unless they have an institutional login. And I really think that librarians need to get behind the open access movement and maybe educate people a bit more about what that means and what potential that has for communities having access to books. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think also I wonder what other people's experiences are, but using suppliers that institutions are set into and using supplier selections, which lots of public libraries that have cut, will just have a selection of books that the supplier will, like 500 children's books, or just one stock manager who doesn't work in branch, that doesn't know Fred that comes in every Friday and likes this kind of fiction. There was some research done by Liz Chapman in 2015 on LGBT literature, might be young people's actually, looking at suppliers, looking at a book list of like good LGBT fiction, and found the suppliers actually deliver a very poor amount, as opposed to if you're a librarian with a credit card and you could go to a shop where you could choose books yourself.
Yeah, I mean, my experience working in public libraries for a couple of different local authorities is that the stock librarians don't exist anymore, or they're very few and far between, and that it is done through the supplier aggregators. And so how can the different kinds of libraries and librarians start to rebuild relationships with smaller publishers, or find different ways of different models of enabling different kinds of literature to reach different kinds of people, rather than based on just what sells or what's in demand? Has anyone got anything to add to that?
I think there's something to be said for the reservations, especially within the public libraries. If I can remember correctly, it was a free service, and usually people could access it through the interlibrary loans. So that would mean someone trying to see which university had it, and then that being posted back to the public library, or it would be an item that needed to be bought in, and that did somehow kind of create a sort of sense of democracy in terms of choice. But at the same time, books were being weeded and taken off the shelves if they hadn't been taken out within a certain time frame. So it was kind of like a double-edged sword in terms of what was visible to the public and what wasn't visible. But I think the library tours that we do as library assistants and library workers should be an empowering connection right at the beginning to kind of let people know that this is a collection that you have an influence over in terms of how it's used. Someone's library choices becomes data for what remains in the library, and also for research in terms of what are the topics, and also for the kind of costs that go towards authors in terms of how many times their books are taken out. You know, those things are really, really important.
I think definitely it's under prioritized, and there's a real fear that if you don't have queer people in certain positions, that it's not something that's prioritized, and there's rarely money for it, or we're told that there's not money for it. I mean, the Queer Library in Dublin, that was all review copies. That was people donating books from the community, and me making lists of publishers from the backs of books and writing to them and saying, "Can you send us books?" It wasn't. And similarly, in public libraries, as you say, Saradha, the reservation system was really how we got a lot of queer books. And it's we have queer people requesting these books, and then queer staff members would also request things and say, right, we need to rebalance this somewhat and make sure that these materials are represented and are in here. But I don't know what the solution overall to that is.
I think as well with there's that tension again between that grassroots way of collecting and the academic way of collecting. They have their pros and cons, I suppose. I mean, somewhere like 56A Info Shop, where a few of us have volunteered over the years, is a library generated by donation, which is wonderful because people know that they're a place which will accept, and there's really no, something will come in and go, yeah, we'll have it. But it means you're reliant on someone just looking in their bedroom maybe and think, oh, I've got a cardboard box here with a few editions of Passion Brigade, I'll give them to 56A, and you might get issues 1, 5 and 7, and that's brilliant, and it's better to have them than not. But there's nothing more you can do, and then you look after those. Whereas an academic library potentially could actively go and buy all of those, but then you get the problem that certainly I've found with institutional libraries is that there's a sort of difficulty of getting things that do not come through mainstream supply financial chains as much as anything else. I would say where I am now at Senate House Library is the one place where I've not had that problem. The way I can go to the procurement manager and say, could you use the credit card to get this from so-and-so, it's £1.50, it's a small, and they'll do it. But I have worked at other places where they said, no, it can't be done. We can't do that. If it doesn't come through Dawson Era, or it doesn't come through, sorry, not them now, but, ProQuest, it can't be bought. And that sort of eliminates huge ranges of voices and small press voices. And again, is another reason why I think that the symbiosis between the radical, the grassroots and the institutional can sometimes just go clunk and can't really sort of work in tandem.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's such a marketisation of libraries, both public and academic, and especially in central London, there's this whole big thing about, we don't have enough space, so we'll just get rid of these collections. It's really hard to kind of justify, use the word Leila earlier, serendipity, which I think is so important in libraries for all kinds of communities, including queer communities, just to stumble across something and whatever. That's becoming less and less of a thing now as we have to reduce our collections.
There's also the situation in academic libraries of reading lists and what, how they determine collections, and not being able to co-produce collections and not having student input on collections. And, hopefully that's starting to shift a little bit.
I mean, each university library is somewhat different in its kind of acquisitions model, I think, but for the main lending collections, where I work, it's the teaching collections are the lending collections, and they are completely driven by what's on the reading lists. So if it's not on a reading list, we don't buy it. We do allow students and researchers to do purchase suggestions on an individual basis, but the main collection is driven by what's on the curriculum.
There have been a few campaigns, but
yeah. Oh yeah. So I've worked on Black History Month and anti-racist campaigns to change collections and things, but that's not within the model. And then you've got a lot of students and academics trying to decolonize the university and decolonize collections, but that's also within and against the models that would allow that. But what I was going to say with it being with university libraries, teaching collections being more driven by what's on curricula, and there's less subject librarians these days selecting stock. What I worry about that is we're starting to see with the kind of financial crises that a lot of universities are in, that particularly have been accelerated with this pandemic, is that university degree programs in the humanities and the social sciences are beginning to be cut. And that's where we're likely to find more of the queer literature. So you may have lots of queer librarians. In fact, in every library I've worked in, I've known many. I think my queer circles have been mainly generated through my library circles. But that doesn't necessarily get reflected in any of the decisions around the collections because of the neoliberal models of how these universities or institutions are run. So that's something I have a worry about, and I'm wondering what we can learn then, or what we can think about together in terms of the very different kind of library of a grassroots activist library that will be, fully focused on sort of more radical collections that are community driven, but then don't have the infrastructure and the support around nurturing and developing those collections financially as well. So that's a sort of double bind that
there is the idea of reactivation, though, I think, which I think comes from it, like places like Interference Archive in New York, which is but they have a very different model because they're in the States and they've got these amazing fundraising abilities there. But they use that term, I think, and so does the Mayday rooms in London, that even if you cannot buy loads and loads of new things, you can reactivate what you have and make it, either people can learn lessons from them and think, I won't make that mistake again, or you can critique them with a contemporary eye, or you can just show that this story got this far. Why hasn't it got this far? You can use them to challenge lots of assumptions. Even if you had 10 books, you could do that, I think. And I think, you can, in a sense, do a lot with very little.
I love that concept of reactivation, or, the living library or the living archive, and what that can mean with working what you've got. Yeah. Would anyone else like to add to that?
I guess one thing I wanted to bring up that maybe harks back to, Alice, your early comment about, is a library just a room of books in, or, there are people there curating it, making intelligent choices. I was talking to Isidore from the Book 28 library, which sounds very similar to Ciaran's Outhouse library. They're now based within a queer homeless shelter called the Outside Project in central London at Clerkenwell, and they were approached, because they were already doing it on a volunteer basis, they were approached by the Outside Project to go, people keep dumping books here, there's just like all this like crap books that is like a library, please come and like would you come and sort it out? And now that collection, through volunteers, they've been curating it, and it's a really, really good queer collection. I thought that was really interesting in terms of thinking about, there's a lot of academic writing and critiques of little free libraries, like libraries that are just junk in phone boxes. And I thought that was quite an interesting example of that in a queer context.
But there are a lot of misconceptions, or perhaps lack of thought around what a library is. Library as a collection of books or as space versus something that is organised, facilitated, activated or reactivated. So my argument there would be that a library is not a library without the people who can do that, organising, activating, discovering. We talked a little bit at the beginning before the panel began about an African proverb which goes something like, when an old man or a person dies, a library burns to the ground. There's lots of resonance there, isn't there? The idea of books burning also makes us think of these fascist and totalitarian times that we're living in. But would anyone from the panel like to talk about the idea of libraries living in people or collections of people?
I suppose it really chimes with me when Seamus Heaney, who opened the National Poetry Library in the South Bank Centre, when he passed away, there was a sense for me that we wouldn't get another book from him. And so it really chimes with the idea that we in ourselves, the stories, how we individually as library workers, library users, encountered the library, those stories are particularly of interest because they show a kind of a learning process about ourselves within a context, a shared context, a community context, a public context, and with these intimate spaces, these nooks and crannies, these quiet spaces, these hidden places that we can find ourselves. And it's only within the last few years I'm really beginning to understand the sort of the intangibility of libraries because of the closures across the country, and also the openings of the national it's not, I don't know if it's going to be called the National Manchester Poetry Library, but it has a kind of national status in Manchester, a new poetry library being opened there, and the poet laureate really kind of lauding that library. But that doesn't really I think there's a way that we need to look at the whole library sector and the different sections of libraries and how we can bring it all together under one big kind of tapestry or kind of quilt pattern to understand how that we are kind of all interconnected.
Well, I love that as an image, a library quilt that's keeping us all warm.
I feel like I'm going to add a slightly negative note there, but I think the idea of collecting people's stories is true. But how do we still reach out to those people who don't cross the physical or theoretical idea of a library? How do we add those stories into that mix? And I think it just goes back to what we were saying earlier, that some spaces feel more belonging to everybody than others, and it may not be the truth of them, but it's how they feel and how do we continue to present them. And even DIY spaces can be exclusionary. You know, I've been to DIY spaces, taken friends who are not part of that political scene maybe, and every place has its own language, I guess, and if you don't feel familiar with that language, and I don't have any answers to this. I think the thing is we're all working on it, and we're all trying to find ways through it constantly, and talking and having discussions like this. You know, it's all these different, every one of us from a very different experience, and all of us trying. And I think that's the key thing to keep on, because it is about keeping on and pushing it. And although maybe Section 28 has gone, there are other barriers that are taking its place, or it's not gone maybe in reality. Like what Colette was saying, a lot of people feel that it's perhaps still there in spirit, if not in law, you know. And I think that a lot of these things that we're doing, I like the hopefulness of libraries, but to me there's something still to very much aim for, I think.
I feel like definitely to like come in on what you're saying, Leila, is I obviously don't know the answer either, but I think my feeling is that it's going to be like a multi approach, a variety of approaches, and some that we haven't even fully discovered yet. And people are, as you say, on the ground doing different types of work. But something that is really, that we can think about a really queer perspective on that, is that there is no fixed end, and in the same way with collections and talking about like controlled vocabularies, a challenge to that is that there is no final thing, there is no final vocabulary, there is no final solution to all of our, it's just lots of people around the country doing tons of different things.
It makes me think about the idea of questioning, and how someone walking to the library, they may be questioning a multitude of different issues around identity, and how libraries are a questioning space, and that fluidity that a queer perspective can bring to these kinds of discussions.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the main things that I want to keep in the forefront of my mind as a librarian is that we have to be reacting flexibly now as well. Like with the pandemic, we don't really know what libraries will look like tomorrow or next year, and I think that we just need to always remember, try and keep in focus what the important work is to do, and not be kind of hung up on tradition if possible, even if those traditions are our own traditions that don't seem particularly old-fashioned, but everything's changed now. So
I think I found in my research as well, I mean, I really wanted to write quite a hopeful dissertation about really great things that happened in history, but a lot of the conclusions were, well, we did used to spend all day, having a meeting, choosing queer books really well. Now we just don't have the funds all the time. And I think with library closures, libraries being moved into trusts, libraries in church hall where queer people will not go, those are sort of things we need to worry about. I think the pandemic is a really good point. I think lots of library workers are quite safe by being government workers and not put on to furlough, like in public libraries at least. Obviously, the poetry library has been one where staff have been treated really terribly. I think Croydon, Tower Hamlets, some other libraries nationally are currently handcuffed, and there's petitions and writing to councillors that we all need to do as library workers to support those communities, because when they come for us, we'll need our colleagues' support as well.
So we've got just a few minutes left, and we have actually had a couple of questions submitted through to us. The first one is from Magda, and Magda says, I'd like to add a question about some of the institutional constraints that the panelists have experienced in trying to add, preserve and promote queer voices in the library.
I was just going to bring a point about I'm aware that, for example, the Poetry Library is trying to digitise its collections, and it's received funding to do that, and there is a priority to do that, and that requires a lot of work in terms of getting permissions, and it's the work of library assistants, and I think, but then there's also on the other side to give people digital access, making sure that they can access these collections.
That's pretty much exactly what I was going to say. We need to start thinking about digital preservation, but also digital objects potentially getting lost in the World Wide Web. How are we going to surface those for people or make them more visible, I guess?
And I guess things that have happened quite quickly, like the EU legislation with Brexit, means that works that are orphan works, so someone else might be able to find them better than me, but works where an author isn't known, the entire Spare Rib magazine collection was available by the British Library, and then that's just cut off because with Brexit, the things that have happened, those have certainly affected the ability to access digital collections as well.
I think another thing to add on the other dimension of preservation that I just sort of highlighted around preserving people's knowledge of the collections in the library and the work. Having read some of your dissertation, Colette, and also my own PhD thesis, I think we draw on testimony of librarians, and I think I think that should be for library users and library workers and activists of all kinds as well. So I think we are in a way losing generations of knowledge from the library sector, and documenting them, archiving them, surfacing them is also really important.
It's like all the ghosts of library workers, isn't it, that have formed those sort of collections. And you see that, I think I've talked to Richard at Centre House about this a lot, about how did we get these? Why have we got so many of these type of thing? And why have we got it's almost as if there was potentially one person who was doing all that work and was saying, I'm going to keep this, we've got flyers, amazing flyers from protest marches that have got boot stamps on because they were picked up off the floor and salvaged, and someone put it in the library. Who did that? And what was their impulse, and what else did they do at the same time? And much less rich, how less rich the collection would have been if that person hadn't bothered who was obviously at the demo, picked it up and then brought that into the library. And 75 years later, people are going, wow, but that's been preserved. And I think we've lost that knowledge already, who did that. And it does make it very interesting looking at a library collection, because it is definitely not neutral. It is definitely, you can sense the people who collected those works and their interests throughout it. We've got some very unusual emphasis in Senate House Library because of that, and it makes it the interesting collection that it is. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think that's why it's so important for us to battle against this idea of neutrality as well, because it's like and it's such a bland word as well. Neutrality. It's making spaces and collections bland, and it's like one homogenous idea of like objectivity. And our collections are, as you say, Leila, like that's where the richness is people collecting things based on, they did have an agenda, but that's an exciting agenda to see 75 years later or 2 years later. Like, what were the people working here? What did they want people to see?
And I think that could be a message for everyone listening as well, and watching, and just the library users and people in general. Like, we're living in times that are obviously so changeable, and we don't know what tomorrow looks like a lot of the time with the pandemic and some deeply troubling political happenings all over the place. But alongside that are lots of protests and activist movements as well, which are growing. And so how they can be documented. So if you're involved in a grassroots project or a creative project, and you think that needs to be in a collection, knowing which organizations and libraries or archives to approach to perhaps work with on that. I know when it comes to queer collections, the Bishopsgate Institute Library do a lot around that, and they often put calls out for, even placards and ephemera to be donated. And the whole thing with Bernie Sanders mittens recently, I know the Vermont, is it the Vermont Folklife Centre or something? They're archiving those memes. So I don't know. I'm just thinking along the preservation lines that we preserve what we should preserve what we want to see preserved as well, and that needs to come from the people as well as the librarians.
I think that can change a little as well. With I think some of the people might know a lot more about like donation agreements, but with the Feminist Library thing again, people who donated works, donated a lot of their collection, and now who maybe are hostile to trans community, are now objecting that their collections are there because they don't agree with the collection policy. And obviously that can go the other way. The Women's Library moving from an independent library to being within LSE, and that's about collections as well, and where those bigger forces of institutions and universities, because one university loses a lot of money and has to like sell a whole collection, change the dynamic way that people feel about those collections.
It's making me think about the library user now becoming a library detective in order to find out where to find and access information and who to ask, and that becoming less available. So I think there is a need for a kind of collectivism around how do people find these things.
Yeah, and how do you know about them in the first place? To go and find them. I think that's the thing. If you don't know what you're looking for.
This is from Vanessa. The question is, when libraries are often deemed as cost centres to funding bodies or institutions, and are frequently left out of institutional strategies, brackets, often because a library does what a library does is not really understood by those institutions. Can the panel share some thoughts or experiences of both the opportunities and constraints this generates for librarians to create spaces for queer visibility, belonging and resistance that help nurture queer communities?
I wonder what people think. I think we spend a lot of time advocating our service, and like we spend a lot, and that maybe that is outreach as well, and reminding people what a library is, and that people do still read books, and it's not like a room of dusty old books, and it is relevant. And oh yeah, we do have ebooks, and they're like constantly that, but maybe because I can't see the wood for the trees. I think one thing that is interesting in the council I work for is a lot of our counsellors and senior staff are LGBT, and they're really, really keen on our LGBT History Month, and they, so they pick up on that and they promote that, and that does elevate all of the services that we do in terms of disability.
I feel like it's very important to just like conceptualize libraries as almost to go back to what libraries are as spaces of freedom and not spaces where there's expectations. Because if you have a cost center, then, or if it's being viewed as a cost center or in opposition to institutional strategies, it's treating libraries as these like factories for, you know, students or users to become productive. And then, you know, that can sort of seep into a lot of the work that happens in libraries. So for example, like well-being work that takes place in libraries, is it, you know, well-being in and of itself, or is it well-being to create a productive person so that they can go back to work, you know, and start producing value? And, you know, I think it's just as workers ourselves being able to resist that, and queerness is part of that resistance. It's part of, you know, I know for myself, the advocacy work with mental health and with queerness, just even thinking about the mental health work, it's about reframing it rather than reframing it from the medical model of where it's the person is broken to the, you know, a social model where we think about mental illness as like an adaptive response to environment and all of the pressures that are being put on people. And that's one of the ways that queerness can help battle that notion, and libraries can help battle that notion of being of productivity and like toxic positivity, and just allowing people a space to be free. And that's what libraries are. Libraries are free space that, you know, sorry.
I think it's hard. I think it's really hard though. I mean, not to try and end on a negative note, but personally I find it really hard to be able to justify our existence to the powers that be when they want us to compartmentalize our work down into, something that generates money or generates, you know, whatever, some tick box thing. I don't want to do that. But I know if I don't do that, if I don't kind of like take the events that I do or the things that I do and kind of wrap it up in that kind of rhetoric, then it's not going to be understood by university management. I don't have any easy answers for it. I personally am having a bit of an identity crisis, I think, in the academic library world at the moment, and I don't really think it's going to get better with the cuts and stuff on the horizon.
I hear you with that, Melissa.
I mean, I think the idea of being in a place of crisis, or a place of, for me, just waiting to see what happens with the National Poetry Library, and the emotional value of the library had to be explained back to the management through the petition, through hundreds and hundreds of voices, some I knew, some I didn't know, of saying what it meant for them to access the library. And that library needs to be open 24 hours, as because poetry is a life force. And I think academic libraries need to have also follow Goldsmiths, trajectory in terms of, access at all hours. And I think it's really important that we do find a language, and it is coming towards that, where we are finding qualitative and quantitative ways of looking at the impact of creativity, impact of language, impact of the humanities, the sciences, and how they need to come together. This is a Renaissance movement that is happening now, and COVID is a gift for that, because we're now understanding what it means to be queer, to not be able to touch somebody that you away from your partner, for example, if you don't live with them. But now knowing what it means to be an asylum seeker with barriers in terms of movement, we now know what it means to be someone living with a long-term condition. So that the lockdown in itself and these ideas of crisis are points where we can create change just by noticing how it's making us feel.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a really good point to end on there, Saradha. Thank you. I don't think I can wrap that up in better words, but I'd like to. The one word I'd like to repeat from what you just said is life force, I think. So let's leave on that note. Library is life force, and with that comes various battles, but I think the force is strong. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. It's been a real pleasure talking to you all.